So Gumbrecht, welcome to the Prokop Center. I want to start this interview in a traditional, perhaps somewhat old-fashioned way. Can you talk a little bit about your academic background and academic career? Where did you study? Where did you get your first chair? When did you move to Stanford and so on?
Yeah, I studied in 1967 at the University of Munich. And I had spent the year before in a high school in Paris, Lycée Henk. So that was a certain proto-academic stage at a very, very good high school. And I enrolled in German and Romance literatures. So you have to do two subjects, as you know, in Germany. And then after the first semester I changed Romance literatures, Romanistic and German. Then in my third year I went a year to Salamanca, to Spain. That was 69-70. And I got so bored in Spain. I loved Spain, but I got so bored at the Spanish University in Franco times that like a child playing with dolls, I started writing a dissertation. I didn't have an advisor or anything like that. So I wrote much of my dissertation on medieval hyperbole in that third year in Salamanca, and then, fortunately, I found somebody who was interested in this dissertation who, without having seen me, offered me a job at the University of Constance. So then I went in 1971 to the University of Constance, which was then a newly founded university. It was supposed to be eine Reformuniversität, and with an agenda of kind of innovating what would be academic life and what would be humanities, what would be research. I stayed there until the end of 1974 as an assistant in the German sense, which in American I always to explain something hybrid between a graduate student and an assistant professor, because you're not independent, you depend on somebody, you have a boss. 1/3 of your work goes into the work of your boss. In my case I think it was more than 1/3 anyway. And then January 1st, 1975 I became a professor at the University of Bochum.
It was at the age of 26, wasn't it?
At the age of 26, yeah. If you want an anecdote, because you kindly asked about that.
Absolutely.
So I got the offer, and I accepted the offer. You know, it was a Lehrstuhl, it was a half, and then it was H4, then C4, was not W3, full professorship. And then all of a sudden I get a letter, unfortunately you have to return your full professorship, because being a full professor requires that you're a state employee, and there's a law since Bismarck that you have to be 27 to be the state employee. And as you are not 27, you don't fulfill the conditions. And I consulted a lawyer, and the lawyer said, no, this is legally binding. Once they've made an offer and you've accepted the offer, and that's a contract, they cannot. And so there was of course a complicated situation, and thank goodness somebody with a famous name, Hans Mommsen, a historian, came up to propose that the solution would be that I would substitute myself for a year, which I did. So my first contract read the Privatdozent, Dr. Ulrich Gumbrecht substitutes, replaces the full professor. So, okay. So I was very young, and then I was in Bochum for 8 years. I mean, Bochum is a very good university actually, but it's the opposite of Constance. In the industrial region, you know, would be the, I don't know, something like Leeds or so.
Well, it's actually Sheffield's twin city. It's very.
Oh, it really is. Well, then everybody knows what
Sheffield. Yes.
I think Sheffield is much more beautiful from what I've seen so far. But it was a new university, very hard-working university, so it was the opposite of Constance, and I liked being there. I mean, I remember every day in Bochum, 8 years, was tough work, was hard work. But I think it was good for my little socialization. And in Bochum, I mean, if I look back what I did there, you know, I tried to be a guter Romanist. I mean, I tried to write essays, to write books. I wrote a book on Solar, for example. It's just a monograph on Solar. There wasn't anything that I would associate today retrospectively with saying, oh, I did something new, or I did something that would define me intellectually.
And then you moved to Siegen in 1983?
In 1983 I moved to Siegen. I mean, yeah, it was 1983. I quit Bochum in 1982, and then I was for half a year visiting professor at Berkeley. But that was planned, and then I already had the job in Siegen. And I went to Siegen to meet you in Siegen, because Henk was then working in Siegen. No, he came later. And Siegen, which was another new university, but very different. I mean, this was a time when Germany was so wealthy that they founded universities everywhere. And nobody really knew why they had a university in Siegen. I think this is why they hired a couple of young people with ideas, because there was no point about this university. So with a very, very supportive chancellor or provost, you would say, in the United States, And that enabled us to do many things, but basically three things. They financed 5 colloquia that we were running in the then Yugoslavia, today Croatia and Dubrovnik.
Yes.
I hate the word interdisciplinary, but they were interdisciplinary, and the point was kind of to reset, redefine the agenda of the humanities. And some people who we were lucky enough to persuade to participate, like Friedrich Kittler or Jan Assmann, but also more famous Jean-François Lyotard, Niklas Luhmann, I mean, ended up being among those people who redefined the humanities and the social sciences at large. I'm not saying we did, but it was I think it was one of 5 or 10 places where this happened. So this is something I'm very proud of, and this is, yes, something I would associate with what I'm doing now. And the other thing, as you know, they allowed us to found, as a model experiment, the first graduate school ever in Germany. I mean, at the same time they had one in the sciences in Tübingen. And that was fantastic because we got all of a sudden, we had 1,500 applications for 15 fellowships. First, and really, this first generation was absolutely amazing, and the second generation was very good too. And it was again an experiment. I mean, try out, shape something, and I mean, as we talked about yesterday, I think there are now close to 280 Graduiertenkollegs in Germany, which I think is too many, but that's not my problem. But
and you had a number of very famous guests. I think Derrida came
Derrida,
to
the first and only
school.
visiting professorship of Derrida in Germany ever was there. You know, we had Lyotard twice for an entire month, which was absolutely fantastic. We did daily, I mean 5 days per week, we did seminar with the whole afternoon. We had Jacques Le Goff, who was then the world leading medievalist, and I mean, couldn't remember them all. We just had this open budget, was great. And all of a sudden, this university, the entry of Siegen in the last Brockhaus, like British Encyclopedia, would say that there's nothing you can say about Siegen, only 2 things. It was the most central town in the geography of the former Western Republic, if you cannot say. And it had the most precipitations in West Germany. It's the only thing you could say about Siegen, as you know. But all of a sudden the university was something. That was not only me, there was your advisor.
I remember the year I was there, it was actually voted by Der Spiegel as Germany's best university.
Yeah, I was so happy that you were saying that, because it would have been I was already at Stanford, so I could say it actually without bragging. But this was
I think you were still there.
No, it was 1990. I mean,
the way I remember it was 1989 when I was there, and you were there as well, and that was in the Spiegel. But anyway,
Stern. It doesn't matter. I mean.
Let's move on to Stanford. Yeah. You went to Stanford in 1989.
Right.
And when did you become an American citizen?
2000.
And there's a swearing-in ceremony for that, isn't there? How did you experience that?
It was actually very beautiful. Because first of all, there's always a person, normally from the legal system, a judge or something, who swears you in, and it's only 1,500 people. Yeah? And to say something politically incorrect, first of all, that judge was very beautiful, so it was nice. Very beautiful young judge who was swearing us in. It was moving because, I mean, this is California, so you know, I would say 1,400 among those 1,500 people, no, but 1,300, 1,200 were Latinas. That was interesting. The rest from Asia. Very few people from Europe. Yeah, and I'll never forget what this judge said, and this is something that makes me like to be American. She said, "This may be the only citizenship in the world where, in the moment that you're sworn in, you're a complete citizen. There is no ethnic, no cultural background. There's no condition. I mean, you're sworn in, you fulfill the conditions, you have passed your little exam, that you know enough English, you know something about the Constitution, and from that moment on you're American." And for some reason that moment was very pathos laden for me.
I was going to ask you about what you just mentioned. To what extent do you feel a full-blown American, and to what extent do you still feel partly German or a hybrid?
I get normally introduced, at least in Europe, by saying he is a German-American literary critic or whatever I am. And that's fine, and that's correct in a way, but I much prefer people saying he's American. Yeah? I wish I had no accent, unfortunately. That's the one language where I cannot get rid of the accent. But anyway, I mean...
I was going to ask you about that as well, because there are a lot of full-blown Americans who still have an audible non-American accent. Henry
50%.
Kissinger, yeah, but also a number of famous ones. Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger's from the same county as I am.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, Fareed Zakaria. But do you feel that you stand apart from Americans with a pure American accent, or precisely because there are so many people with a non-standard American accent?
No, I think it's, I mean, it is demographically, statistically completely normal. I'm just, you know, given our profession, I'm kind of ambitious about language, or more ambitious than, let's say, a surgeon or a lawyer, perhaps, when lawyers also speak in public. So I would love not to have an accent. I also have a couple of languages, Romance languages, where people, even French people tell me, and French people, when I tell you, don't have an accent. But French people don't notice normally that I'm not French. Plus my family name is Alsatian, so I fulfill the requirements, but in English you hear that. But I think the problem is that Americans will never correct you. I mean, and not because they're so wonderful, but because it's so normal. 50%, that's the estimate, of American citizens have some accent that is non-American. But in terms of what I identify with, and I'm not saying, oh, this is an only positive history, the US is only glorious, but I have never had the feeling in the 52 first years of my life that I now have with America, yes, that this is a country I identify with. Now, I'm not identifying in the sense everything is okay, but let me say, I care profoundly about the US. Also in the sense, you know, if during my German life there would have been a threat of a president or chancellor in Germany as horrible as Trump, I wouldn't have voted that man or that woman. But now I care. I mean, what will happen to my country if somebody like Trump becomes president? So it's a very strong identification.
How do you, sorry for interrupting, how did you experience 9/11? Was that a very emotional thing for you?
That was very, very deep. Actually, I shouldn't refer all the time to something you wrote, but I wrote on I think 9/15, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, published in their feuilleton 2 facing pages, and that was me, how I experienced 9/11 in California, and Susan Sontag was the same time in Berlin and how she experienced it. And I mean, you know, unsurprisingly, me, the one who had chosen to be American, you have of course a different relationship. I wanted to be American, and I thought how horrible that was the first time that there was an invasion to the territory of the US. I mean, not how horrible, how evil are they, but how profound that impact was. Whereas Susan Sontag had more or less this thing that's well-deserved. Yeah, and we have to think about, I mean, they were opposing pieces, I'm not saying she was wrong, but it was interesting that the person had been born in the US and grown up in the US had a very different relationship to it.
A lot of left-wing intellectuals took that, in my view, rather problematic stance. But let's now move on to your work. You are best known, I suppose, for your work on 3 concepts. I'm simplifying a little bit: Stimmung, latency, and presence. I know that these concepts are interrelated, but I want to try and tackle them individually to the extent that that's possible. So let's start with Stimmung, which is a German word signifying something like atmosphere or mood. Why is this concept so important to you?
I mean, there are different reasons. You know, the concept probably among the 3 you mentioned that I'm being most associated with, and one could construct, this was not my intention, is foundational for the 2 others, is presence. And I've never had the ambition, like some people whom we appreciate and like Niklas Luhmann or like S.J. Schmidt, to deductively develop my project. So I rather, when I do something new, I always want to escape presence, and then at a certain moment I realized, no, it's again has the same intuition inherent. What interests me about the way I try to define and explain Stimmung, atmosphere, mood, in Romance languages, climate is the metaphor that you use for clima in Portuguese and Spanish, for example, is that I believe it is something that is always triggered by what I would describe as the slightest possible touch of the physical environment on your body. It can be my touch when I do like this, but it's also the touch of the temperature, it's the touch of a voice, hence Stimmung, which, I mean, if I could ever translate that word literally, would be voiceness. but also music and so forth and so forth. And as Toni Morrison very beautifully described, she said in jazz, I mean, mood is like being touched from inside. I like this paradox because nobody can touch you from inside, but we all know it has to do something with a slight impact on your body, and it produces a psychic state. So the relationship to presence is this touch. It interests me from a different perspective, and that would be rather perspective of a literary critic. I mean, if you exaggerate and say there are basically two approaches to literature. One is quote-unquote realistic, so literature always represents something that's going on in the world. And then there's the opposite one, take Paul de Man, literature shows you that this is impossible, that reference is impossible. My intuition is, and my almost empirical conviction is that one of the most important, even statistically most important motivations for people to read what they call literature is to immerse themselves into a Stimmung, a specific Stimmung. I mean, favorite, most obvious example being something like Death in Venice. I mean, nobody reads Death in Venice to know how the love story will end. I think that is clear from page 1, that, as they say in The Godfather, finiscerà malamente. It will not be a good ending. You don't read, and my mother was asking me always, kriegen die sich am Ende? Will they get each other? But this is not how you read that. And I would say all the grand novels of the 20th century, take À la recherche du temps perdu, take Ulysses, take Musil, take D'Arrigo, for example, they are really, I'm not saying they are about this, that the author had this intention, but what we associate with it, what is their appeal, is the possibility in a more or less sophisticated way to immerse yourself into such a climate.
So you try and locate Stimmung kind of in between, say, cultural studies, which posits a link, a representational link between the text in a broader sense of the word and reality, and, let's say, deconstruction or post-structuralism, which says that there is no such link, or if there is a link, it's a bit like Wikipedia. You click England, and then it says it's an island, and then you click island, and you go to water, and you keep clicking without ever reaching something outside of that text.
Now, I'm of course not saying that Stimmung is the one and only truth. I'm just saying, if you had a spectrum, so to speak, that Stimmung of possible motivations to read literature, pre-conscious motivations. I mean, Stimmung occupies a very broad segment of that spectrum. And has hardly ever been described in literary criticism. I think partly because once you identify a Stimmung, you can point to it, but different, from any hermeneutic approach, there's not much you can write about it.
Can you so maybe say a little bit about the relation between Stimmung and an extra textual reality? For example, in this book, Atmosphere, Mood, Stimmung, you talk about, among other things, the work of Caspar David Friedrich, and then and I'm quoting, situate Friedrich and his works in relation to the epistemology of the epoch, that Michel Foucault, more than 40 years ago, identified and described as the crisis of representation in the order of things, les mots et les choses, occurred historically as the emergence and institutionalization of a role that Niklas Luhmann, the German sociologist, has called second-order observation. So you do make a link between Friedrich's paintings and a reality, and also actually a historical reality, a historical reality, or the historical reality in which those paintings were produced.
Yeah, I mean, if you look from the side of readers, I mean, so not why do literary critics read Ulysses, but why would somebody, take something easier to read, why would somebody who's a cultivated person but is not a colleague of ours read Musil, Man Without Qualities? I think the promise and the appeal is this immersion into a world whose otherness, capital O, is appealing. And this is Vienna in the year preceding the beginning of World War I. I mean, as everybody's saying, this was a big threshold, so it was a different world. It was, they call it French La Belle Époque. And if you read the 1,500 pages of that fragment of a novel, yes, you feel you are in that world. I mean, you begin to feel you know those characters. Now, this implies, and that's I think a little bit where you were going, that Stimmungen are normally historically specific. And if they are historically specific, then you have an additional scholarly question, and that is the question, how can you explain that a certain Stimmung that we find in Musil, or a certain Stimmung that I try to identify in the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, is more typical for the early 19th century or for the early 20th century in the case of Musil than others. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, then, for example, what I describe about Walter von der Vogelweide, who is a late 12th century, the late 12th century most important German troubadour.
So you're making a distinction between the Stimmung that a reader experiences on the one hand, and theoretical, literary, historical reconstructions of the production of the text, and also as a possible explanation for the Stimmung that the reader might experience.
That is a good distinction. I would say on the pedagogical side, so to speak. So how does it change teaching literature to undergraduates once you have made a point about Stimmung? As I'm saying, but I think that's rather pleasant than not. There's much to be done. I mean, you draw their attention to a Stimmung and let them play with this dimension, and also take away the bad conscience. You know, sometimes they feel, oh, this is not enough, I have to find some.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, if you read Death in Venice and get into this heavy weather, into this feeling, into these daydreams that it produces, that's perfectly legitimate. I don't think necessarily one should prescribe any reader or our undergraduate students to do more with it. If they want to do more, there's much more to be done. But and then you can ask yourself, is this also interesting from a scholarly point of view? And I think from a scholarly point of view, the one interesting thing is to explain the historicity of that moment. I think the chronologically most recent, latest chapter, there are very short chapters in this book that you were kind enough to draw attention to, is on Janis Joplin. Yeah, and I try to explain what the connotation of that word of nothing left to lose, the liberty of nothing left to lose, what that was. And I try to explain why around 1968 that was a prevalent feeling. That was interesting for me because I'm part of that generation. Yeah.
I was going to ask you a question about that anyway, because I think it's the most fascinating chapter in the book on Janis Joplin.
Some people think it's the worst chapter.
No, I think it's a wonderful chapter and wonderfully written as well. I'll come back to it in a moment. Do you think that a certain, just coming back to the theoretical concept of Stimmung, is there a certain, do you see links between your views and, say, Paul Ricoeur's view? Ricoeur says that on the one hand, yes, a text has a certain structure to it, but on the other hand, it kind of projects a world, and there is possibly some sort of vague link between the text and the historical world, for example, it describes, but all those links are, as Ricoeur put it, en quelque sorte en l'air, and it's for the reader to fill up those gaps, as it were, so that the text makes a proposal for a certain kind of experience or feeling, and then a reader brings his or her own experience to that, and that's how Stimmung emerges, or is that putting things too simplistic?
No, it's beautiful. I mean, in the first place, and in general, I mean Ricoeur is one of those, I would even say, giants of our profession. I refer by profession to the humanities and arts, that I love to be associated with, although this is the first time in my life that somebody officially and explicitly associates me with.
Oh, we aim to please.
Yeah, I mean, it had to happen one day. Absolutely. So if you say something like that, and I mean it, you always want to state a difference. My impression is that in Ricoeur, then there's always ultimately a hermeneutic quest. I mean, a hermeneutic quest in the sense of what an analytic philosopher would call a propositional content. And my point, I mean, I would recycle a word that we were using too much in the late 1960s. I think my proposal is more radical in that sense. Like I said before, and that's fine. if the immersion into that world is all you get out of it. Doesn't mean that's the necessary end of it, but I feel you don't always have to push. You know, a good example for the bad taste of pushing. I think everything you can get out of the magic flute is a certain Stimmung of the late 18th century. You know, if you push like my much admired friend Jan Assmann did a magic flute for propositional content and the serious philosophical content, what comes out is complete crap. So sometimes I think it's really, it was same with Thomas Mann and Death in Venice. I think it's good enough to feel it's very hot in Venice.
Okay, let's come back to Janis Joplin, because again I think that is a great chapter, and one of the key ideas, or perhaps the key idea, the way I read the text anyway, in that chapter is, and I quote, perhaps there was never a time when Janis Joplin was as close as she is in the present, now that that age appears irreversible for us. In Janis Joplin's voice we recall a freedom we did not sense in the present of the past. We have forever missed our date with Janis Joplin, I think is the final sentence, and I wonder if this, I wonder whether this was inspired by Hans Robert Jauss, who writes about Schillers über naive und sentimentalische Dichtung, and Jauss says, describing Schillers text, nicht das objektiv Schöne der griechischen Dichtung an sich selbst, vielmehr die Tatsache, dass ihre naturhafte Vollkommenheit für uns unwiederbringlich verloren ist, begründet das, was sie uns zum Ideal werden lässt. Is that kind of a similar idea that you're trying to develop in the chapter on Janis Joplin?
Now you're provoking really well. I mean, I will in the first place make a point that I try, for reasons that you know, to execute damnatio memoriae. I will not repeat that name, I will refer to that name as my academic advisor. Who was an important literary critic. Absolutely important literary critic. So I'm not denying that by any means, but I want a certain biographical distance. It was bad enough for me that I was his assistant in the German sense for 4 years. But an important literary critic. Now, yeah, this, for example, this reading of Schiller is very powerful and very important. It's one of his more important essays. And what he says about Schiller is interesting, but I would say there's almost a chiastic relationship with what he says about Schiller and what I try to say about Janis Joplin.
Okay.
And I can maybe explain that within a biographical frame. So we listen to that, yeah, and when I listened to that, I remember, I mean, she had a Porsche and I had a Karmann Ghia, so I was one of her Porsche. But we felt, oh, you know, this revolution will happen. Yeah? I mean, 68, so, you know, and I mean, it almost happened, but there was May 68 in Paris, with barricades and so forth and so forth. This is going to happen anytime soon. And because we thought it's going to happen anytime soon, I think we then didn't really pay enough attention both to the lyrics and the music that said freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Yeah? No, for us there was a lot to be conquered. Whereas today, I think in an age, I'm not saying this is an all dark and horrible age, but it is definitely not an age, not a present of great projections into the future. Yeah, I mean, how humankind, how England, you know, how the United States will be redeemed and finally become that great project. So when I was concentrating on that article again, and I hear, I mean, it's hardly a day that I don't listen to Janis Joplin, to this song specifically. I mean, today I feel I have an immediacy of relationship that is closer, and not only to the lyrics, in a certain way also to her voice and to her death, than I had then when I thought I perfectly understood her. For me this was the hymn of, God knows, socialist revolution or something like that. Even the cause of the death, I don't know whether I knew this already when I wrote the article. I mean, you know, it was that she died by an overdose, heroin overdose, and it was because the heroin dealer had confused her with another person who was more tolerant and could take more. I think based on X-rays or something like that, actually, of course she could have died with an overdose, but she died of a brain aneurysm, meaning it cannot be more random, it cannot be less, you know, say, okay, if you're desperate and take heroin all the time, this is plausible. No, it was this complete randomness of death, and it was this feeling of a liberty that you had because there was nothing left to lose. Like in the lyrics, when Bobby McGee disappears, her life is over.
But isn't that kind of, I'm pressing you on a little bit on this, is that exactly, or similar anyway, to what Schiller seems to be saying in that, you're saying about Janis Joplin, it's not kind of a utopian project or something that I want to take forward now into my own future, but my relation with the text is precisely that it embodies something that is interesting precisely because I know it's irreversibly part of the past rather than of my future.
I would say maybe we could, I mean, to make another famous reference, and that would be Benjamin and the Thesis on History and the famous angel. The angel that moves to the future with the back towards the future and looks back. I mean, it doesn't say much more about it, and I had recently a very good student at Stanford write a fantastic paper about it, and her interpretation of the angel was, what does the angel do with the past, and why does this wind blow from the past that does push you in the future, although you cannot see the future? And she said, these are punctual moments of empathy. Yeah, I mean, you look back, and they're not everything, but there are these moments like this fantastic image of this watch, or this timepiece that shot through. This is time stopped in that moment. I mean, actually something like that exists, this very famous wristwatch from Hiroshima. If you look at that watch, you have a punctual empathy. I think we can never immerse ourselves in this Hiroshima moment. I mean, August 6th, 1945 is gone, will not happen like this, but this watch all of a sudden. In that sense, yes, I mean, if Schiller ever meant that, which you may read, instead of saying I have my doubts, one can read the Schiller text like this. If Schiller ever meant that, I doubt whether my academic advisor meant it like this, but because he was so much, for obvious biographical reasons, into the fulfillment of history and great things happening, don't believe. But if you see it in this way, I mean, if Schiller would be looking back towards a past that is irreversibly gone, but with the possibility of punctual moments of empathy. Yes, beautiful.
Okay. A final question on the same book, and I know it's a point of detail, but I'd like to know your views on this.
I'm not against detail.
You discuss, but we've got 40 minutes for the interview. You discuss Jean-Paul Sartre's 1938 novel La Nausée, and are you making a distinction between the novel's explicit message, as it were, or at least the protagonist's positive or relatively sort of upbeat resolution at the end, on the one hand, and the much bleaker Stimmung that he then falls prey to? Is that your interpretation of the novel? Part of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's something, I haven't written about that, but now that the book is lying there and...
well, because you mentioned it in...
No, but I mean, it's a book and it's not a contemporary, it's an old edition, and I had the same cover, I mean the pocket book with the same cover when I was a high school student. So there are two things. I mean, it comes out of a time when I was already born. Yeah? A time that I can probably, when was it published? 45?
No, 38.
Oh, 38, no, I was not born.
You were born 48.
Yeah, but I mean, when it became popular, I mean, there's an association with existentialism, post-World War II existentialism, and so forth and so forth. And I wanted to say, so in that sense, the Stimmung of that book has a certain affinity with childhood memories. Childhood memories of, I mean, I was born in the second most destroyed town in Europe, Würzburg, and that's why they have until the present day a partnership with Nagasaki. I mean, Dresden has with Hiroshima. So there's this association, and then of course, and that's what I want to say, there is also a 68 association. Yeah, I read this for the first time probably not in France actually, or in Germany, 65, 66 or something like that. I mean, to learn French, that was the main purpose. And then already, at that time already, you would think, yes, you know, the way this book ends, this promise is good, we have to overcome this. We have to overcome this. Whereas now, of course, once again, and this goes back to what we're saying about Janis Joplin, now I feel that this Stimmung that is described there touches me in the literal sense more than the resolution at the end. You could say the resolution at the end for me brings back some 68 Stimmung. Yeah. I mean, I know the book is not from 38, sure. And yet, but this has to do with a long, now incipiently long life of 68 years. Certain rereadings or a conversation like we are having brings back, if you've read it multiple times, different associations.
Okay, because you're writing here, this is the protagonist, Antoine Roquentin. This resolution in no way frees him from matters of atmosphere and mood. At the end of the novel, instead of music offering comfort, bleak weather surrounds him, and then you quote from the novel, night is falling on the first floor of Hotel Montania, lights go on into windows, the smell of wet wood rises from the construction site at the new train station, it will rain tomorrow. That's interestingly enough where the quotation stops here.
I think this is fantastic, these couple of sentences.
But the actual end is these are literally the last two pages of the novel. I know it's a question of detail, but I'm interested in this because I'm interested in Sartre. He hears the black woman singing, La Négresse chante, and then he says, so this is the more positive resolution, as it were. Je sens quelque chose qui me frôle timidement et je n'ose pas bouger parce que j'ai peur que ça ne s'en aille. Quelque chose que je ne connaissais pas, une espèce de joie. So he's sort of kind of happy. La négresse chante, alors on peut justifier son existence un tout petit peu. Je me sens extraordinairement intimidé. Ce n'est pas parce que j'ai beaucoup d'espoir, mais je suis comme un type complètement gelé après un voyage dans la neige et qui entrerait tout d'un coup dans une chambre tiède. So he says, it's not like all is fine and dandy now, but at least it's like I'm sort of coming out of the cold into a kind of a lukewarm or half-warm room, which is a lot better. And then he quotes this jazz song, Some of These Days You'll Miss Me, Honey, which I think is also a jazz song that was played at his funeral. And then the last sentences that you then quote in the book, La nuit tombe, au premier étage de l'hôtel Printania, 2 fenêtres viennent de s'éclairer, le chantier de la nouvelle gare sent fortement le bois humide, demain il pleuvra, sur Bouville. Which, interestingly enough, that last bit, that it will rain in Bouville, is missing here. Of course, he's just decided to leave Bouville, abandon that historical work that he's writing and start to write a novel instead. So if he says tomorrow it will rain in Bouville, isn't he saying, where I'm now, and my existence that isn't happy, there will rain, but I'll be out of here by tomorrow. So don't, this is my reading of the book anyway, don't Stimmung and his resolution actually coincide much more than you're suggesting?
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, I still, when you were reading it, the reason why I skipped the reference, the toponym is simply, if you write something like that and I have to make a long footnote explaining what Bouville is and so forth, I also didn't give the plot. This is part of the readings of that book to, of course, de-emphasize the plot. But anyway, my tendency would be to read it more in a counterpoint way to you. When you were reading it, La Joie de Vivre, I remember, and I kind of projected, and something I'm really looking forward to. I got invited by the State University of Senegal, based on this present stuff that I've written, to teach a seminar for 1 week in Senegal next week, La Joie de Vivre. Yeah, and of course, this is almost kind of in a banal way what you associate with Africa, La Joie de Vivre. And yet, sometimes, for example, with this Trump horizon in my everyday life in the US, and this now really serious threat that this is going to be our next president and this is going to be our Stimmung for at least 4, if not 8 years, all of a sudden, this week in Senegal, to which I'm looking forward to, has a different tonality, and point counterpoint, and it may actually very much be that, as you were reading it, due to circumstances in my life today that are completely random, I again have a tendency to read in a counterpoint way, but not in this kind of shallow way of multiplicity of interpretations. I find what you are saying to read in a different way, so to speak, to read it as an unfolding. I find that absolutely plausible, and I think we could happily live with these two readings.
Okay, fair enough. Let's tackle, we've got about 10 minutes left. Let's tackle the other two, the two remaining concepts, latency and presence. You talk about latency, among other things, in your 2013 book, After 1945. Latency is origin of the presence. And then you tackle presence, among other things, in your book, The Powers of Philology. So there's Stimmung, latency, presence. How do these, you said earlier on, presence is the kind of more foundational concept?
Yeah, I mean, because I believe that the Heideggerian argument, being a time argument, that in any given situation we refer to the world problematic concept, but I say world like Heidegger, that surrounds us in two ways. We cannot help doing that. We always attribute meaning. We sometimes have a problem to attribute meaning. I cannot see those buildings without identifying them. Whether I identify them correctly, whether it's difficult or easy is another thing, or identify this one as utopian, a sound house. So I cannot help doing that. Now, at the same time, I cannot help assessing the space that separates my body or approximates my body from these buildings, which I think the very basic instinct there is tangibility. I can touch you, but I cannot touch this window, and it would take me a long time to touch trees on one of those 7 hills of Sheffield over there. So that's the dimension I call present. And it always exists. We cannot live without both of them. It is interesting, however, that with the early modernity and with the institutionalization of what one can call by shorthand Cartesian subject, I mean, cogito ergo sum, this dimension has been eliminated from our intellectual life. Of course, it always runs. I mean, we're always in present situations, in present relationships, but it is, I wouldn't say it's systematically sealed, but it's become very, very peripheral. And because I think, that in general, of course, it is worth bringing it back into our lives. It is also a dimension that would make the humanities more complex. That doesn't mean against interpretation, against meaning. That exists all the time. This is one thing, and secondly, I believe that what we have been calling aesthetic, and interesting enough, this is a concept that really emerges in the 18th century, so presupposes early modernity, are those exceptional situations where the presence dimension imposes itself. Where you cannot only attribute meaning. So these are the two reasons why, at a certain moment, I felt it was worth talking about presence. And I mean, I don't even have to make this very explicit. I mean, this lightest physical touch on your body, that would be a present phenomenon that you do not get into view as long as you behave. I mean, both in your everyday and as a scholar in an exclusively hermeneutic situation.
Yeah. I mean, there's the Cartesian movement or development, as it were, and then there were various people, as you know much better than me, who were then trying to bring back this sense of bodily experience, but then you had deconstruction, and it was
I just write a book about one of those who tried to bring it back. That was materialism. I mean, so something like The Letter on the Blind or The Letter on the Deaf tries to bring back this dimension. Yeah. I mean, not in a way that I try, but the 18th century materialism is something like that. And I think we both grew up under intellectual conditions in the humanities where this was in an almost, again I use that word in a different context, pathos-laden way removed. I mean, the word substance...
If there was a body, it was a textual construction.
Yeah, yeah. It was very evil to talk about substance. It was very evil to take materiality seriously. If you ever did that, you had to immediately undercut it or to apologize. And clearly what I'm doing, what I have been doing for quite some time now, this is ridiculous for a 68-year-old to say that, but it had an Oedipal dimension. I mean, it was a revolt
Sure.
against the, in Germany, very hermeneutic generation of our academic advisors.
And and what is latency? And how does it relate to presence?
Latency, I would first relate it to Stimmung. We often, I mean, if you describe latency as triggered by the certainty that something substantial, a thing, is in your proximity, but you do not know where it is, nor do you know what it is. Yeah? I mean, a stowaway, blinder Passagier in German, would be in that sense a phenomenon of latency, because sometimes, you know, in the Titanic, for example, the movie, you feel that there are people on the ship, but you don't know where they are. You also don't know who they are. So if they all of a sudden, as it happens in the movie, appear, you know, at Valparaiso, you don't know they are the stowaways. Okay. Now, how can we then talk about that at all? Because we don't see it, or we don't perceive it, and we don't know what it is. So people would say there's something in the air. Yeah? And this something in the air is precisely a Stimmung. So I'm saying not every latency produces a Stimmung, and above all, not every Stimmung is produced by a latency, but there is an interesting relationship between the two. And secondly, now I go back to presence, it is, of course, the certainty of a presence in the literal sense. Something is very close, much closer than the trees on that hill. Can also be further away, but you know what I'm saying. It is a spatial relationship, a relationship that concerns your body, but you're disoriented about it. So this is what I call latency.
And how does this work specifically in your book after 1945? So why specifically 1945? And with the subtitle is Latency as Origin of the Present. So why is latency the origin, or one of the origins of the present?
I know you read the book, but it's difficult to subsume, because it's also, you know, if you write 300 pages and can just subsume it in one sentence.
I know this is because of the interview. You've got to simplify.
Okay, I will. Okay.
What journalists always say: simplify, then exaggerate.
That's nice. I like that. Okay. This has to do with something we were going back when talking about La Nausée, for example. So, childhood years and adolescent years, yeah. And so, as I was saying, I was growing up in that city, and I didn't suffer from that. That was all in ruins. It was actually terrific for a preschool kid. I mean, these were fantastic playgrounds. Our parents would say, you know, beware of hand grenades or stuff like that. It may be dangerous, but we loved to play there. And we played medieval knights, Ritterless, as you would say in Draconian German. And then, you know, and we knew, let's say when I was 4 or 5, I knew that there had been, to pronounce it again in Bavarian, a Krieg. There had been a war. But what that war had been and why the city was bombed, I couldn't get together. And then, you know, we grow up and we start asking questions, and this is what I want to say. There was an absolute stonewalling. And not that people wouldn't say, oh, Adolf Hitler, but I mean, this is where I want to go. There was a very strong feeling of latency, for which I didn't have a word when I was 6 or when I was 12. Started having ideas about it when I was 18. And the point I want to make is that this feeling of latency, under which and from whose perspective I've been trying to describe in the 3 central chapters of the book, the Stimmung of the 1950s up to the early 1960s, the feeling was that there was something there, and if we, this generation of those being born during the last years of the war and immediately after the war, born into Germany, born inheriting a responsibility that we couldn't refer to because we hadn't been born. Yeah? I mean, a guilt, so to speak. We felt if we managed to pinpoint that which is latent, and we thought the best way of pinpointing it was to confront the generations of the perpetrators, then something will happen and history will evolve in a positive way again. I mean, I think that was the very basic feeling, and then, you know, you went to the university, became a member of the Socialist Student Association, and I said, oh, the due course of history, you know, will end up in the telos of class-free society. But the point I want to make with latency was this feeling that something doesn't really develop, something doesn't really happen, something that you have a right to expect, but we can fix it. Yeah? That is in my memory, the feeling of 1968. You confront that generation, you also go to archives, you make this transparent, and then, okay, now what the book is saying, the thesis of the book is that unfortunately this was an error. Unfortunately, this was the effect of a different, I mean, to make a very long story short, as French historians might have said 20 years ago, mentalité, a different frame of mind, I call it, different chronotype emerging, that from that time on and until our present time is in conflict with what has been called in German historisches Weltbild, the historical worldview, and that precisely this kind of congestion, this feeling of congestion, has much rather to do with something that begins to emerge and articulate itself in the late 20th century than with the need to repair the historical worldview, the projection of a different world. You know, what was the hope, for example, of a more just or class-free society?
Okay, I think that's very helpful as an example. I apologize for forcing you into certain simplifications, but it is a 40-minute interview, and the idea is to produce sort of appetizers so that people end up reading your books rather than, I don't think we can expect a full-blown explication of your entire, of all your philosophical ideas. But thank you very much for
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I thank you for the first. There was a couple of things that I've never seen this way. I'd also never thought about the ending of La Nausée, which I don't think is the greatest novel ever, but it's a novel I care about a lot. I mean, for biographical reasons.
Okay.
And I think one of the first things I'm going to do when I get home, I'm going to read the final pages again with time and see whether I can read it less counterpoint.
That's very good. Thank you
okay,
very much.
You.